January 14th, 983 AD. A longhouse in northern Iceland during the polar night. It's been dark for 67 days straight. Not twilight, but absolute darkness, 24 hours daily. The family maintains 3 fat lamps burning continuously because if the light dies, people die. Not from cold, from madness. On this night, the youngest daughter, age 7, is tending the lamps while her parents sleep. She's exhausted. She falls asleep for maybe 90 minutes. When she wakes, 2 of the 3 lamps have burned out. The longhouse is in near total darkness. She panics. In her terror and haste to relight the lamps, she knocks one over, spilling burning seal blubber across the wooden floor. The fire spreads instantly. Smoke fills the closed, heavily insulated space within seconds. Her screams wake the family, but the smoke is already lethal. Thick, black, toxic from burning fat and wood. They have maybe 30 seconds to escape. 4 people make it out. 3 don't, including the girl who knocked over the lamp. The survivors stand in minus 35 degrees Celsius darkness, watching their home burn, knowing they've lost their food stores, their shelter, and 3 family members because 1 lamp fell over. Here's what nobody tells you about Viking survival during the polar night. The popular image shows cozy firelit longhouses with happy families telling stories around roaring hearths. The reality was far more terrifying. For 3 to 4 months every winter in northern Scandinavia, the sun literally didn't rise. Not short days, 0 sunlight for up to 120 consecutive days. The psychological impact was catastrophic. Modern polar researchers, with all their technology, antidepressants, and regular resupply missions, still suffer severe mental health crises during similar darkness periods. Vikings had none of that support, yet somehow maintained sanity and function while living in smoke-filled darkness, colder than most modern freezers. The key was light, continuous, reliable light that proved humans still existed in a world that felt like it had ended. But maintaining that light required technologies so sophisticated and dangerous that one mistake could kill your entire family within minutes. What I'm about to show you isn't some romantic story about simple oil lamps. This was precision engineering using toxic, highly flammable materials in enclosed spaces where ventilation meant death from cold and seal meant death from smoke. Vikings developed lamp technology that could burn continuously for 24 hours or longer, using nothing but animal waste products, providing both light and heat that kept people psychologically stable during months of darkness. But these lamps were as dangerous as they were essential. The fuel, rendered animal fat and fish oil, produced toxic smoke that caused chronic respiratory disease. The flames were open fire in wooden structures packed with flammable materials. The carbon monoxide from incomplete combustion could kill you in your sleep. One overturned lamp could burn down your home and murder your family. Yet Vikings ran dozens of these lamps continuously for months because the alternative, absolute darkness, would drive you insane faster than the smoke would kill you. Stay with me, because the first secret to surviving polar night isn't about light technology. It's understanding the psychological horror of darkness so complete it breaks human minds. Let me tell you what absolute darkness actually does to the human brain. Because until you understand this, you can't comprehend why Vikings were willing to breathe toxic smoke and risk burning their homes down just to maintain a flickering flame. The polar night in northern Scandinavia isn't just dark evenings. It's total absence of sunlight for months. In regions above the Arctic Circle, the sun drops below the horizon in late November and doesn't return until late January. That's 60 to 90 consecutive days of darkness, not twilight, for part of the day. Complete darkness, 24 hours daily. During this period, the only natural light is brief, dim twilight, around what would be noon if the sun were visible, lasting maybe 2 hours and providing barely enough illumination to see shapes. The rest is absolute black. Modern neuroscience and polar research have documented what this darkness does to humans. Within 2 weeks of continuous darkness, your circadian rhythm, the internal clock that regulates sleep, mood, and cognition, completely collapses. You lose the ability to distinguish day from night. Sleep becomes fragmented and disturbed. Within 4 weeks, you develop symptoms indistinguishable from clinical depression, loss of motivation, emotional numbness, inability to feel pleasure. By 6 weeks, more severe psychiatric symptoms emerge: paranoia, hallucinations, complete emotional breakdowns. Modern Antarctic researchers with regular contact with the outside world, antidepressant medications, and psychological support still experience these symptoms. Approximately 15 to 20% require medical evacuation due to psychological crisis during polar night. Vikings had none of this support. They faced 3 to 4 months of darkness with no medication, no understanding of what was happening to them, and no escape. The psychological pressure was so severe, it became embedded in their mythology. The polar night was when the boundary between human world and monster world dissolved, when creatures from outside crept close, when madness was a constant threat. The only defense against this psychological disintegration was light, continuous, reliable light that proved the human world still existed and would return. Fire from the central hearth provided some of this light, but hearth fires required enormous amounts of wood that had to be gathered during the brief summer when collection was possible. A single longhouse could consume 6 to 8 cubic meters of firewood per week during winter, the equivalent of 15 full-grown trees. Maintaining a large hearth fire continuously for 4 months was physically impossible in many regions. The hearth could be maintained during waking hours, but keeping it burning through the night wasted precious fuel and required someone staying awake all night to tend it. This is where fat lamps became not just useful, but psychologically essential. A properly designed fat lamp could burn continuously for 24 hours or longer without attention, providing light and heat through the night when the hearth was allowed to die down. This meant people could sleep knowing that when they woke, there would be light. This certainty that darkness wasn't permanent, that morning would bring flame even if not sunlight, was what prevented complete psychological collapse. The lamp's flame was proof that the human world continued existing despite the consuming darkness outside. But maintaining these lamps was dangerous work that killed people regularly. The fuels were toxic and produced smoke that damaged lungs irreparably. The flames were open fire in structures where everything was flammable. The carbon monoxide from combustion accumulated in sealed spaces, causing deaths that seemed like natural sleep but were actually suffocation. Lamp maintenance was constant work. Wicks needed trimming every few hours or they'd smoke excessively. Fuel needed regular addition or the lamp died. Soot needed cleaning or it contaminated everything. Children as young as 5 or 6 were trained in lamp maintenance because every family member had to be capable of keeping the flames alive. The psychological pressure on whoever had lamp duty was enormous. If you fell asleep and the lamps died, you plunged your family into darkness that could trigger panic and violence. Archaeological evidence shows violent deaths during winter that historians attribute to cabin fever, what we now recognize as acute psychological breakdown from extended darkness and confinement. Can you imagine the terror of waking in absolute darkness, not knowing if the sun would ever return, surrounded by family members who might be descending into madness? This was the reality fat lamps fought against. But lamps were useless without fuel, and obtaining that fuel required understanding which animal fats burned cleanly and which produced toxic smoke that would kill you faster than the darkness. Picture yourself as a Viking preparing for polar night. You need fuel that will burn continuously for 120 days. You have no petroleum, no coal, no gas. Your only option is biological fat from animals. But here's the deadly problem. Different fats produce vastly different combustion products, and choosing the wrong fuel can fill your sealed longhouse with smoke. So toxic, it kills everyone inside within hours. Let me explain the fuel hierarchy that separated survival from catastrophic failure, starting with why rendering fat was as dangerous as it was essential. Raw animal fat cannot be burned directly in lamps. It contains too much water, blood, and protein tissue that creates horrible smoke and unstable flames. It must be rendered, a process that sounds simple but was genuinely dangerous. Large quantities of raw fat, kidneys, intestinal deposits, subcutaneous layers separated during butchering, were placed in iron cauldrons or wooden troughs and slowly heated over the central hearth. The temperature had to be precisely controlled. Too cool and the fat wouldn't liquefy. Too hot and it would scorch, creating acrid smoke and ruining the entire batch. As the fat melted, water and protein impurities separated out. The liquid fat was carefully ladled off the top while hot, strained through cloth to remove any remaining solids, and poured into storage containers to cool and solidify. The danger came from the enormous heat energy involved. Several kilograms of fat, at temperatures exceeding 150 degrees Celsius, represented a massive thermal and fire hazard. Spill it, and you've created burning liquid that adheres to skin, causing horrific injuries. The steam rising from rendering fat could scald exposed skin. The smell was overwhelming. Rendering beef fat produced relatively mild odor, but rendering seal blubber created a stench so powerful it penetrated every fiber in the house for weeks. The fuel hierarchy was based on combustion quality and availability. At the top was rendered beef or sheep tallow, pure white or pale yellow solid fat that burned cleanly with minimal smoke and almost no smell. This premium fuel was used in living spaces where people slept and worked. The problem was availability. In northern regions where agriculture was marginal, cattle and sheep populations were small. A family might slaughter 2 or 3 animals per year, yielding perhaps 15 to 20 kilograms of renderable fat total. That sounds substantial until you calculate consumption. One medium lamp burning continuously for 120 days consumes approximately 40 to 50 kilograms of fuel. One family needed multiple lamps. The mathematics didn't work. Premium tallow had to be reserved for the most critical lamps in sleeping areas where clean air mattered most. The middle tier was pig fat, softer than beef tallow, melting at lower temperature, available in larger quantities in agricultural regions. Pork fat rendered well but had disadvantages. It went rancid faster than beef tallow, especially in fluctuating temperatures. Rancid fat was still burnable, but produced acrid smoke and horrible smell that contaminated food stored nearby. The flame from pork fat was less stable, requiring more frequent wick trimming, but it was more available than beef tallow, making it the standard fuel for most households. The bottom tier, and this is where things became genuinely unpleasant, was fish oil and marine mammal blubber. Coastal communities in Norway and Iceland relied heavily on these fuels because they were available in enormous quantities. Cod liver oil was rendered from the livers of cod caught during winter fishing. Seal blubber came from hunted seals. Whale blubber was harvested when whales beached or were hunted. These fuels burned well and were effectively free, but they came with severe costs. The smell was atrocious, thick, oily, fishy odor that permeated everything. The smoke was dense and greasy, depositing thick layers of soot that coated walls, ceilings, utensils, clothing, even food. People living in houses, lit primarily by fish oil lamps, absorbed this smell so completely that visitors could identify them by scent alone. More seriously, the combustion products from fish oil contained higher concentrations of toxic compounds that caused respiratory damage. Chronic bronchitis, emphysema, and lung scarring were epidemic in coastal communities that relied on fish oil lighting. The absolute bottom of the fuel hierarchy was waste fat, materials that no sane person would normally burn, but became essential in desperate conditions. Bone fat was extracted by crushing animal bones into fragments and boiling them for hours. Fat globules floated to the surface and were skimmed off. This bone fat, or boiled fat, was cloudy, foul-smelling, and produced terrible smoke, but it was completely free, extracted from bones that would otherwise be discarded. Rancid fat that had spoiled beyond edibility was still burnable. The smell when burned was genuinely sickening, but desperate times demanded using every available calorie. Even the scraped-off soot from previous lamp burning could be reprocessed, dried, mixed with small amounts of fresh fat, and formed into fuel cakes that burned poorly but extended fuel supplies. This waste-to-fuel economy revealed the resource scarcity Vikings faced. Nothing could be wasted because winter survival margins were too narrow. Can you imagine breathing air thick with smoke from burning rancid bone fat for 4 months straight, knowing that stopping the lamps meant psychological collapse into darkness-induced madness? But having fuel meant nothing without the container that could hold it safely while burning. And that container had to be carved from a stone with properties that seem almost magical. There's a stone that Vikings valued more highly than iron for winter survival, and when you understand its properties, you'll see why. Steatite, commonly called soapstone, is a metamorphic rock that seems purpose-designed for creating lamps, except it wasn't designed. It was formed by geological processes that happened to create the perfect combination of properties needed for safe fat combustion. This stone is soft enough to carve with simple tools, but heat-resistant enough to withstand continuous flame contact for decades. It has thermal mass properties that turn a simple lamp into an actual heater, and finding it, quarrying it, and carving it into lamps was specialized knowledge that took years to master. Steatite's first critical property was workability. It's soft enough that you can carve it with a knife. Literally, on the Mohs hardness scale, where talc is 1 and diamond is 10, soapstone is around 2 to 3. You can scratch it with your fingernail. This meant Viking craftsmen could carve complex shapes using nothing but iron knives, chisels, and scrapers. No specialized stone-cutting tools were needed. A skilled carver could transform a raw steatite block into a functional lamp in a single day's work. But this softness was paired with exceptional heat properties. Despite being soft, steatite doesn't crack or fracture when heated to flame temperatures, approximately 600 to 800 degrees Celsius at the point of contact. Other soft stones like limestone would explode from thermal shock. Soapstone simply absorbed the heat without damage. This heat resistance, combined with high thermal mass, steatite's ability to absorb and store large amounts of thermal energy, created the magic that turned lamps into heaters. Here's how the thermal mass physics worked. When a steatite lamp burned fat for hours, the stone absorbed heat throughout its entire mass. A 1 kilogram soapstone bowl could store approximately 800 joules of energy per degree Celsius temperature increase. After burning for 3 to 4 hours, the stone might reach 100 degrees Celsius throughout its mass. That represented approximately 80,000 joules of stored thermal energy, equivalent to a 60-watt light bulb burning for 22 minutes. But unlike a light bulb that releases energy instantly, the stone released heat slowly over hours through infrared radiation. Even after the flame died, the hot stone continued radiating warmth for 6 to 8 hours, creating a slow-release heating effect. A large soapstone lamp burning through the night would still be warm to the touch in the morning, providing residual heat long after the flame extinguished. This thermal mass effect was the difference between waking to freezing darkness and waking to relative warmth that made getting up psychologically bearable. The lamp carving process required genuine skill. Craftsmen started with raw steatite blocks quarried from known deposits. Norway and Sweden had extensive soapstone quarries that were mined for centuries. The carver first shaped the exterior using saws and files, creating the basic bowl form. Then came the delicate work of hollowing the interior. This required removing stone material without creating thin spots that could crack, or making walls so thick they'd waste internal volume. The typical lamp wall thickness was approximately 1 to 2 centimeters, thin enough to maximize fuel capacity, thick enough to provide thermal mass and structural strength. The interior had to be smooth to prevent fuel from getting trapped in crevices. Some lamps included a channel or spout for the wick to rest in, keeping it positioned properly. More elaborate lamps had carved handles or decorative elements, geometric patterns, simple animal shapes. The finest examples showed remarkable artistry despite being functional tools. The finished lamps came in multiple sizes, serving different purposes. Small handheld lamps were approximately 10 centimeters diameter, holding perhaps 50 to 100 milliliters of fuel, burning for 2 to 4 hours before needing refilling. These were portable light sources for moving around the longhouse or doing short tasks. Medium lamps were 20 to 30 centimeters diameter, holding half a liter to 1 liter of fuel, capable of burning 8 to 12 hours continuously. These were the workhorses of household lighting. Large stationary lamps could reach 40 to 50 centimeters diameter, holding several liters of fuel, designed for the 24-hour slow burn technique that provided continuous heat and light through entire days and nights. These massive bowls weighed 10 to 20 kilograms when empty, 30 to 40 kilograms when filled with fuel. They weren't moved. They were positioned strategically in the longhouse and maintained in place throughout the winter. Archaeological excavations consistently find these lamps in sleeping areas near walls, positioned where they'd provide light and heat to specific family zones. Can you imagine the labor of quarrying stone, carving dozens of lamps for a single household, knowing that if you made the walls too thin and one cracked during use, spilling burning fat across sleeping people, you'd be responsible for deaths? But even the perfect lamp was useless without the component that actually created flame, the wick that transformed solid fat into continuous controlled combustion. The wick seems like the simplest component of lamp technology. Just something that burns, right? Wrong. The wick is the most critical engineering element that determines whether your lamp burns cleanly for hours or produces toxic smoke that poisons everyone. Vikings understood wick science so well that their techniques weren't improved until the invention of braided cotton wicks in the 18th century. Let me explain the physics of capillary action that makes wicks work, and why choosing wrong wick materials could fill your house with lethal fumes. A wick functions through capillary action. Liquid fuel is drawn up through tiny spaces between fibers against gravity, delivering fuel to the combustion zone at the tip. The physics are complex, but the practical requirements are specific. The wick material must be fibrous with lots of tiny channels for capillary flow. It must be absorbent to hold fuel. It must have a high ignition temperature so it chars rather than burns completely. It must produce minimal ash and smoke when combusting. Viking wick materials were chosen empirically through centuries of trial and error to match these requirements. The primary wick material was sphagnum moss, bog moss, that grew in enormous quantities throughout Scandinavia. This moss had near-perfect wick properties. Its cellular structure featured microscopic channels that absorbed and transported liquid fat efficiently. The moss could absorb 12 to 20 times its dry weight in liquid. This absorbency created excellent fuel delivery to the flame. When dried properly, moss burned slowly, producing relatively clean flame with acceptable smoke levels. The moss harvesting and preparation process was specific. Collectors gathered living moss from bogs during summer, carefully selecting the newest green growth which had the best absorbency. The moss was dried in the sun for several days until completely desiccated. Any remaining moisture would create steam and smoke when the lamp burned. Dried moss was stored in large quantities because a household needed kilograms of it for a full winter. When needed for wick making, the moss was moistened slightly to make it pliable, then twisted or braided into thick strands, approximately 5 to 10 millimeters in diameter. The tightness of the twist mattered. Too loose, and the wick would burn too fast. Too tight, and capillary channels would be compressed, preventing fuel flow. The wick length was typically 10 to 15 centimeters, long enough to reach deep into the fuel supply, short enough to maintain structural integrity. Alternative wick materials were used when moss was unavailable or for specific purposes. Flax tow, the short fiber waste from linen production, made excellent wicks that burned cleaner than moss. Flax wicks produced brighter flame but consumed fuel faster, making them better for work lighting where brightness mattered more than fuel economy. Hemp fiber worked similarly to flax but was coarser. Twisted wool yarn from old clothing could be used in desperation, though wool produced more smoke and smell than plant fibers. The most desperate wick material was twisted strips of old fabric, worn-out tunics or blankets cut into thin strips and twisted. These burned poorly with lots of smoke, but in fuel crisis situations, any wick was better than darkness. The wick maintenance was constant critical work that determined lamp performance. As the wick burned, carbon accumulated at the tip, forming a mushroom-shaped char that increased smoke production and reduced light output. Every 2 to 4 hours during active burning, this char had to be trimmed off using special wick trimmers, small iron scissors or tweezers designed specifically for this task. Trimming required care. Cut too little and smoke continued. Cut too much and you shortened the wick unnecessarily, requiring earlier replacement. The wick position also needed adjustment. If the wick extended too far above the fuel surface, the flame was too large, consuming fuel rapidly and producing excessive heat and smoke that could crack the stone. If set too low, the flame was dim and could extinguish. The optimal position was having the wick tip extend approximately 3 to 5 millimeters above the liquid fuel surface, creating a flame approximately 1 to 2 centimeters high. Adjusting this required poking the wick down or pulling it up using a small stick or the wick trimmer. The wick lifespan depended on fuel type and burning intensity. A moss wick in clean beef tallow might last 20 to 30 hours of burning before being consumed to the point where replacement was needed. The same wick in dirty fish oil might last only 10 to 15 hours before becoming too sooty and degraded. Wick replacement was a regular task. Pulling out the spent wick stub, cleaning any remaining char from the lamp, and installing a fresh wick. This operation had to be done carefully to avoid spilling burning fuel. The typical procedure was waiting until the fuel burned low and the flame was small, then quickly removing the old wick and inserting the new one, while the remaining fuel was still liquid enough to wick up. Can you imagine the skill required to maintain a dozen lamps simultaneously through a 4-month polar night, trimming wicks every few hours around the clock, replacing spent wicks, adjusting flame heights, all while breathing toxic smoke in near darkness? Yet this was standard household work, often assigned to children as young as 6 or 7 years old because everyone had to know lamp maintenance. But perfect lamps and wicks still required mastering the slow burn technique that allowed 24-hour continuous operation without constant attention. Here's the technique that seems physically impossible until you understand the thermal physics, making a lamp burn continuously for 24 hours or longer without adding fuel or adjusting the wick. Modern people think this requires some complex mechanism, but Vikings achieved it using nothing but understanding heat flow and phase transitions. This slow burn method was the key to surviving polar night because it meant you could sleep knowing light would remain when you woke. Let me explain the engineering that made this work. The slow burn technique required three specific conditions working together. First, a large thermal mass lamp, typically 40 to 50 centimeters diameter, carved from thick soapstone, weighing 20 kilograms or more, empty. Second, solid fat fuel, rather than liquid oil, beef tallow, or sheep fat that was solid at room temperature. Third, a carefully sized wick, positioned for minimal flame. The physics was elegant. A large block of solid fat, several kilograms worth, was placed in the cold stone lamp. The wick was positioned so just its tip protruded from the solid fat surface. When lit, the small flame generated heat sufficient to melt a tiny pool of liquid fat directly around the wick, perhaps 10 to 20 milliliters of melted pool. This liquid fat was drawn up the wick by capillary action and burned at the tip. The heat from the burning wick and the gradually warming stone slowly melted more fat at the edges of the liquid pool, expanding it. But this melting happened very slowly because most of the heat energy was being absorbed by the massive stone bowl itself. This created a self-regulating system that's thermodynamically elegant. If the flame grew larger, it generated more heat, which melted fat faster. But faster melting meant more liquid fuel available, which the wick wicked up more quickly, which created a larger flame, which consumed fuel faster. This positive feedback would normally cause runaway combustion, but the thermal mass of the stone intervened. The extra heat from the larger flame was absorbed by the stone, reducing the heat available from melting fat, which reduced liquid fuel availability, which reduced flame size. Similarly, if the flame grew too small, less heat was produced, less fat melted, but the stone was already warm and continued melting fat from its stored thermal energy, maintaining fuel supply. The stone acted as a thermal buffer or damper, preventing flame oscillations and maintaining steady, slow combustion. The fuel consumption rate in slow burn mode was approximately 20 to 30 grams per hour, barely enough to notice. With a 3-kilogram fuel charge, the lamp could burn for 100 hours continuously before exhausting the supply. But the practical runtime was limited by wick life and soot accumulation to approximately 24 to 36 hours before maintenance was required. The flame produced by slow burn mode was dim, comparable to a modern single-candle flame, producing maybe 1 to 2 lumens of light. This wasn't bright enough to work by, but it was sufficient to prevent absolute darkness. You could see shapes, make out where people were sleeping, navigate the longhouse without tripping. Most critically, the psychological impact of that tiny flame burning through the night was enormous. It proved humans still existed. It meant morning would bring light to rekindle larger flames. It prevented the psychological collapse that total darkness caused. The heat output from slow burn lamps was modest, but significant in well-insulated longhouses. One large soapstone lamp in slow burn mode produced approximately 50 to 100 watts of heat output, comparable to a modern incandescent bulb. This doesn't sound like much, but remember, the stone itself was a heat accumulator. After burning for 8 to 12 hours, the 20-kilogram stone mass would be thoroughly heated to perhaps 60 to 80 degrees Celsius. That represented approximately 15,000 to 20,000 joules of stored energy that would radiate for hours even after the flame died. In a longhouse with meter-thick turf walls where heat loss was minimal, 3 to 4 large slow burn lamps could maintain interior temperature 5 to 10 degrees Celsius above exterior temperature, the difference between surviving the night and freezing. But the lamp distribution throughout the longhouse had to be carefully planned because positioning them wrong could create cold zones where people froze or hot zones where fire risk increased. Walking into a Viking longhouse lit by fat lamps was entering a sensory environment so alien to modern experience that it's almost impossible to comprehend without having experienced it. The atmosphere was thick, hazy, with visibility measured in meters, not tens of meters. The air smelled of burning fat, wood smoke, unwashed bodies, wet wool, and livestock. The light was dim, flickering, orange-yellow, casting deep, mobile shadows that created constant movement perception. The temperature was stratified, warm near the ceiling where smoke accumulated, cold near the floor where dense air pooled. Let me describe the reality of living in this environment for 4 months straight, because understanding the sensory experience explains why Vikings tolerated conditions that would seem unbearable to us. The smell was the most overwhelming element. Burning animal fat, whether beef tallow, fish oil, or seal blubber, produced distinctive odors that permeated everything. Clean beef tallow burned relatively neutrally, producing a smell similar to cooking meat. Seal blubber created a heavy, oily, marine smell that was distinctive and persistent. Fish oil was the worst, thick, acrid, fishy odor that got into clothing, bedding, stored food, even people's hair and skin. The smell couldn't be escaped because the source was the lamps that provided necessary light. Archaeological analysis of preserved Viking textiles shows deep penetration of lamp smoke compounds into fibers. The smell was literally baked into their possessions. Modern experimental archaeology projects, where researchers live in reconstructed Viking longhouses, report that the smell becomes somewhat tolerable after 3 to 4 weeks as olfactory adaptation occurs. Your nose stops registering constant odors, but visitors to these experimental houses are immediately overwhelmed by smells that inhabitants no longer consciously notice. The smoke was equally pervasive. Fat lamps, especially those burning lower quality fuels like fish oil or using poorly trimmed wicks, produced visible smoke, not thick enough to obscure vision completely, but enough to create a constant haze. This smoke accumulated under the low ceiling, creating a distinct stratification. The air at floor level was relatively clear. From about 1 meter height upward, smoke density increased significantly. Near the ceiling, 2 to 2.5 meters high in most longhouses, the smoke was thick enough to make breathing uncomfortable. This stratification meant adults standing upright breathed significantly more smoke than children who were shorter or people who sat on floor-level benches. The smoke's composition included not just carbon dioxide and water vapor, but also complex organic compounds from incomplete fat combustion, aldehydes, ketones, aromatic hydrocarbons, many of which are toxic with long-term exposure. The soot from this smoke deposited on every surface: walls, ceiling beams, stored tools, hanging food. Everything accumulated a greasy black coating that was sticky and difficult to remove. Archaeological excavations of Viking longhouses find soot layers millimeters thick on preserved wood, with chemical analysis confirming the soot came primarily from fat lamp combustion rather than wood smoke. The lamp placement strategy balanced light distribution, heat effectiveness, and safety. The central hearth provided the primary light and heat source during waking hours, positioned along the central axis of the longhouse. Fat lamps supplemented this with localized lighting. The most common position was in wall niches, small alcoves carved into the thick turf walls at waist to shoulder height. A lamp placed in a niche illuminated the immediate area, typically a 2 to 3 meter radius, while the niche protected the lamp from being accidentally knocked over. Niches were concentrated in work areas where fine detail tasks happened, where women spun wool and wove fabric, where men carved wood or repaired tools. The sleeping benches along the walls each had at least one lamp providing dim light through the night. Wealthier households had hanging lamps suspended from ceiling beams by iron chains. These provided better downward light distribution, but were more expensive and posed greater fire risk if they fell. The fire danger from lamps was constant and deadly serious. Every lamp was an open flame, in contact with highly flammable fuel in a structure made almost entirely of wood, turf, and textiles. Knock over a lamp and burning fat spread across wooden floorboards, igniting them. The fat would flow into cracks, creating fires that were extremely difficult to extinguish. Spill burning fat on wool bedding and the entire sleeping platform could ignite within seconds. The sealed, insulated nature of the longhouse that made it thermally efficient also made it a death trap if fire started. Smoke accumulation was so rapid that people could be overcome before escaping. Archaeological evidence shows that longhouse fires were a regular catastrophe, with some sites showing clear evidence of total destruction by fire. The safety protocols around lamps were strict. Children were taught lamp handling from young ages because everyone had to know proper procedures. Lamps were never left completely unattended. Someone always had responsibility for monitoring them. Fuel was stored in sealed containers away from flames. But accidents still happened because humans get tired, make mistakes, and one moment of inattention could be fatal. Can you imagine living for 4 months in an environment where the air was barely breathable, everything was coated in greasy soot, and a single knocked-over lamp could burn your family alive? Yet this was preferable to the alternative of darkness. But lamps still required fuel, and obtaining enough fuel for winter required an economy so efficient that literally nothing was wasted. The waste-to-fuel economy of Viking lamp technology reveals something profound about survival in resource-scarce environments. When margins are thin enough, the concept of waste disappears entirely. Every possible source of calories had to be extracted and used. Modern people throw away food scraps, bones, spoiled fat, without a second thought. Vikings would have considered this insanity because those waste products were lamp fuel that meant survival through one more night of darkness. Let me show you the complete hierarchy of fat extraction that turned animal carcasses into maximum possible energy. The economic logic was ruthless. When an animal was slaughtered, the resource allocation followed strict priority. First priority was fresh meat for immediate consumption, the highest quality protein consumed while fresh. Second priority was preserved meat, salted, smoked, or dried for winter food stores. Third priority was edible fat for cooking and nutrition, the cleanest fat deposits rendered and stored for food use. Fourth priority was technical fat for leather preservation, wood treatment, and soap making. Lower quality fat, unsuitable for eating, but useful for materials preservation. Fifth and final priority was lamp fuel, whatever fat remained after all higher uses were satisfied. This meant lamp fuel was by definition the lowest quality, least desirable fat available. But lowest quality didn't mean unusable. It meant fat that required different processing or had undesirable properties for other uses. Bone fat extraction was the ultimate expression of this waste-nothing economy. After meat was consumed, bones remained. These bones, especially large leg bones, vertebrae, and skulls, contained significant fat deposits in the marrow and periosteum. This fat was extracted through a laborious process called bone boiling. The bones were smashed into small fragments using stone hammers. This broke open marrow cavities and increased surface area. The fragments were placed in large cauldrons of water and boiled for hours, often 6 to 8 hours or longer. As fat heated above its melting point, it liquefied and separated from bone material, floating to the water surface due to lower density. This liquid fat was carefully skimmed off using wooden ladles. The quality was poor, cloudy, contaminated with bone fragments and protein particles, with horrible smell when burned. But it was free fuel extracted from materials that would otherwise be completely wasted. A complete cow skeleton might yield 3 to 5 kilograms of bone fat, enough to fuel lamps for weeks. Rancid fat was another waste product that found use as lamp fuel. Fat stored for months or years eventually oxidized and spoiled. developing rancid smell and taste that made it inedible. Modern people discard rancid fat immediately. Vikings burned it in lamps. Rancidity didn't significantly affect combustion properties. The fat still burned, producing heat and light. The smell when burning was terrible, worse than fresh fat. But in a longhouse already full of smoke and odors, this was tolerable. Rancid fat was typically burned in workshop lamps or storage area lamps where people didn't sleep, reserving cleaner fuels for living spaces. Fish processing waste created another fuel stream. After fish were gutted and cleaned for preservation, the heads, entrails, and bones remained. These were collected and boiled to extract fish oil. The resulting product was cloudy, smelly, contaminated with protein particles, but it burned adequately. Coastal communities that processed massive quantities of fish during summer harvests could accumulate hundreds of liters of this waste fish oil that fueled lamps throughout winter. The psychological adaptation required to live with this waste fuel economy is remarkable. Modern people are conditioned to equate waste with disgusting and to avoid contact with spoiled foods. Vikings had to maintain the opposite mindset, recognizing that rancid fat, bone scraps, and fish guts were valuable energy resources worth saving and processing. This mindset extended to other household waste streams. Rendered soot from previous lamp burning was collected, dried, mixed with small amounts of fresh fat, and formed into fuel cakes. These burned poorly with lots of smoke, but they extended fuel supplies during scarcity. Even the char trimmed from wicks was saved. It contained absorbed fat that could be squeezed out and reused. This complete utilization of every possible calorie source was what enabled survival in environments where resources were genuinely scarce, and winter survival margins were measured in weeks of fuel supply. The winter fuel calculation was brutal mathematics. A household with 5 people needed approximately 4 to 6 lamps burning continuously, 2 to 3 in sleeping areas, 1 to 2 in work areas, 1 in the entry area. Each lamp consumed approximately 25 to 40 grams of fuel per hour, depending on flame size. Running 6 lamps for 16 hours daily, the period when central hearth wasn't burning, consumed approximately 2.4 to 3.8 kilograms of fat daily. Multiply by 120 days of winter, and you needed 290 to 460 kilograms of lamp fuel for one winter. That's an enormous quantity, representing fat from approximately 30 to 40 sheep, or 5 to 6 cattle, or hundreds of seals or fish. Gathering this much fuel required intensive summer labor: hunting, fishing, rendering, and storage. Running short meant rationing lamps, reducing burning hours, which meant more darkness and higher psychological stress. This is why every scrap of extractable fat mattered. The difference between adequate fuel and shortage could be 10 to 20 kilograms of bone fat or waste fish oil, and that shortage could mean the difference between maintaining psychological stability and descending into darkness-induced madness. We see that Viking fat lamp technology was far more than simple lighting. It was a complete survival system that integrated geology, chemistry, psychology, and economics into one essential technology. The soapstone lamps, with their thermal mass properties, turned simple fat combustion into heat storage. The moss wicks, with perfect capillary action, enabled controlled burning. The slow burn technique allowed 24-hour operation, maintaining light through the endless polar night. The waste fuel economy extracted every possible calorie from animal resources. All of this worked together to fight the true enemy. Not cold, not darkness itself, but the psychological collapse that extended darkness caused in human minds. Vikings proved that surviving impossible conditions doesn't require advanced technology. It requires understanding your materials deeply, using every available resource completely, and accepting harsh trade-offs like breathing toxic smoke for months because the alternative is worse. Want to explore more lost survival technologies that kept ancient people alive in conditions that would kill modern humans within days? Subscribe to Medieval Spirits right now. We're uncovering forgotten knowledge that proves human ingenuity can overcome any environmental challenge when survival depends on it. Join us as we investigate how Inuit peoples created permanent warmth in snow houses using only seal oil lamps, remarkably similar to Viking technology. How ancient Chinese engineers developed coal gas lighting systems in the 10th century. How medieval European miners created underground oil lamps that burned for weeks, guiding them through absolute darkness. These aren't just interesting history. They're demonstrations of what humans can achieve when we truly master our materials and accept no waste. The Vikings showed that surviving 4 months of toxic smoke and fire danger was worth it to maintain the light that kept minds sane during endless darkness. What other extreme survival technologies have we forgotten? Find out on Medieval Spirits. Hit subscribe, because the past isn't primitive. It's a testament to human determination to survive no matter what nature throws at us, and we're revealing it one video at a time.